Namaskara, Bengaluru. Namaste, India. Good afternoon, good evening, Asia. Welcome again for this edition, the 7th edition of ITSM India podcast. Today I have a distinguished guest and does not require any introduction in the IT service management space. However, it will be my pleasure to introduce him to you for today's session. The person today has got over 20 plus years of experience in service management and has been involved in IT service management best practices since 1989, has been a major contributor to the related publications. His credits include the version ITIL V1, V2, V3, ISO IC 20000, ITSMF UK's Pocket Edition and Dictionary, and also the ITSMF Netherlands ITSM Library. He's been very much involved with ITSMF in various roles and also filled in a lot of roles within ITSMF UK and ITSMF International. He's an IT service management consultant, trainer, having delivered training and seminars in almost every continent except for Antarctica. So I think that's the only thing that he has not wins. Welcome, Ivor Macfarlane today. It's great to have you. Good morning in the UK. It's about 11 o'clock there, isn't it?
It's just gone 11 here, yes, and I still unfortunately got to do some work today, but it's lovely to join, and it's a good job. The video's useful on the grounds that you can at least demonstrate my grey hair and my age in this business.
So that actually denotes the wisdom that you have actually gained over the period of years, and you can pass on some of that bucks for people who are aspiring to be in the service management space. So
So I make no claims to wisdom. You can.
So today we wanted to discuss for our viewers in India in the service management space to understand more about the ITIL history and how was it actually transformed. So I have a few questions because I came through the ITIL V2 managers course. I was not the early adopter. So just tell me about ITIL history, how it started, how did it go across from version 1, who were the original pioneers who started ITIL as a framework, and how has been the journey from ITIL version 1 to version 3. So if you could just give us a quick recap of the journey, it will be helpful.
Yeah, I will try and do that. Certainly, I will put the caveat right up front that this is my interpretation and my memories of things. And there may be other people out there who remember things differently.
Yeah.
But I joined a branch in the UK government. I worked for the UK government for over 20 years, and I did what people do in big organisations. I applied for a job because it was a promotion. And then after I got the job, I asked what it was. So I found myself in a team called the GITIM branch of CCTA, which was to develop a new approach to things called the Government IT Infrastructure Management Method. And the reason that was done was because UK government realised a couple of things. One was that they were really good at producing new software. They had a methodology called SSADM that they developed that was excellent in making average people do good jobs. But they also realized that despite all this wonderful software they were producing, they weren't actually delivering the goods. And that in terms of actually delivering IT services, they weren't good. So there were two things that made sense to them. One was, since the SSADM approach worked very well, they'll develop an equivalent one for operations called GITIM. And secondly, this was at the height of Mrs. Thatcher and the public sector bad, private sector good attitude. So the obvious thing to do is just to go and look at what the private sector does, write that down, make the public sector do it, and wow, everything would be perfect. Two things happened. One was that they decided that it wasn't going to be a method, so they decided in a quick corridor conversation to change the name to a library. They changed the name to the IT Infrastructure Library. And losing that word government off the beginning was incredibly useful. Because people out there wouldn't touch anything called the government something. The second thing that was really important was that UK government was right that they were abysmal at delivering viable services, they'd failed to notice that most everybody else was bad as well.
Right.
We went out and wrote some stuff down, and we discovered that the books were beginning to sell in the private sector very well indeed. So there was a quick readjustment. So the very first books were perhaps a bit more government focused. After that, we were aware there was a broader perspective.
Right. So what did the ITIL version 1 contain? How many books did it contain, and what was the kind of core volumes did they have across?
Oh, well, I've actually just put a presentation together about that, so it's fresh in my mind. I've just got to find somewhere to do it. I did a presentation and a webinar a while back. The first 5 books to be published were, the first one was service level management, and then there was help desk, problem management, configuration management, and change management. So that was the original core, if you like, the first 5 books to be produced. They were written about functions, groups of people. This was pre-processed, really.
Yeah.
And then another 20 or so books were created in the core ITIL sets. There were 5 sets developed. And there's some important things coming out of the past that's interesting. We sat in a room, the team, with a whiteboard and 26 yellow post-it notes, each with the name of one book written on it. And we arranged them into sets, because the marketing guy decided he needed sets in order to market them. And at the very last moment, he suggested that we move the book on testing out of the service delivery set, because it wasn't written yet. A service support set, sorry. And at that point, he could then say, here is one set complete, and now we're working on others. And that's why testing is not there where you'd expect it between change and release, well, software control and distribution there. You'd expect it logically to be there. It was moved for marketing reasons, not for any deep ITIL logic. And to me, that's a really important message for those sitting now and looking back on the history of ITIL 1, 2, and 3. Is a lot of the things that are cast into the way ITIL is built were done for good reasons, but pragmatic reasons. So, you know, please don't take it too seriously.
Correct. That's true. So, with ITIL V1 and, you know, was it a lot of marketing done by those days of OGC, of the Cabinet Commerce, or was it the private who actually started marketing the value of ITIL? How was it when it started off?
We did a bit, and we did have a decent marketing budget, and a guy called Neil Croft was part of the team, and he was responsible for marketing, and he did a good job out there pushing things. But the big difference was when a small Dutch company knocked on our door and said, that stuff you're producing, it reflects what we were doing, and we would like to promote the books. And they were called Pink Elephant. And Nance came and visited us from them, and that was a big step. We then had a private sector consultancy company delivering the stuff, but pushing the books as a non-proprietary product underneath it, and then others came in after that. So the big drive around the world that made ITIL really a commercially successful product was to a great extent driven by a few key private companies, and I'll list 3 of them with credit remember. Pink Elephant, certainly into the Netherlands. Another Dutch company called Prolin, who produced a software tool, and realized that in order to sell the tool, they had to make people realize they needed the tool and therefore understand ITIL and service management. And they pushed it out in Asia. So they were the first people to drive the things into Asia. And Ultracomp, the consultancy company, moved into pushing it into South Africa and with partners into Australia. So there was a big commercial vested interest driving their products, and they used ITIL to do that. The other big thing that pushed it was CCTA, who owned it within the government in those days, worked with the British Computer Society and funded the BTS to develop the first ever examination structure. And that was an area I was much more directly involved in myself. So you probably can blame me if you've ever sat an ITIL exam.
So from version 1 to version 2, when was the version 1 released? When was the version 2 released? What is the time frame? What was the reason that they needed to move from version 1 to version 2? Was it more of business demand that you are seeing that, you know, before you... What was the game plan looking like when this journey started?
Right. Well, I think you flatter the organisers of ITIL to think that there was a game plan. They're a bit less disorganised, and I will declare up front now a definite vested interest and some bitter memories about those periods, because it's been sort of airbrushed out of history in a way, some of the things that happened, which is why it's nice to have an opportunity to tell you the way I remember it. But in 1995, it was decided that ITIL should be outsourced. The management of it should be outsourced. Mm-hmm. And after a 6-9 months negotiation, it was actually outsourced to EXIM, the Dutch Exam Institute.
Yeah.
And I went with it, seconded out. So I was the ITIL manager for EXIM, and we started rewriting the books because the job was done, and it was clear that a few things had changed in the world. Basically, IBM had actually made the PC work, and someone had invented this thing called the internet.
Yeah.
And mainframes were being excluded to a great extent by the client-server architecture. So there was clear need to revisit things, on the technical side at least. So we started rewriting the books, and in my tenure for a couple of years, we produced what I still think is a very good book called Service Level Management, The Customer Perspective, mm-hmm. which has still got some good stuff in there, but has been neglected. But after a couple of years, I had about 14, 16 books on the way. We were also working at that time with the British Standards Institution to produce a code of practice, PD 0005. And that was when we first started sitting down talking about process being the core to everything. So that was the driver. The BSI work was the driver to move a process focus, which we incorporated into the ongoing rewrite of ITIL. At that point, the UK government decided that perhaps they shouldn't have outsourced ITIL and decided to bring it back in-house.
Right.
So I got taken eventually, long story, I won't go into my bits there, but I ended up back into CCTA in a job that was not ITIL for 9 or 10 months and wasn't actually allowed to be involved at that point. And other people in CCTA took over, bringing basically the work that we kicked off. And as always with ITIL, I was just coordinating it. Dozens and dozens of really great people were doing amazing amounts of work for almost no money. Most of them for no money at all, and a few authors for a pittance. So I could list a dozen people that were key in making that happen. But that work was brought back in and taken forward by people in CCTA to produce the new look ITIL V2, which was, instead of a lot of small books, a few very big books. And then the
blue book and the red book, namely service support and service delivery, if I remember. That was what.
Yeah, instead of 10 books in 2 sets, each set was now a book. So that most people will probably, a lot of people certainly will remember version 2. That was service support and service delivery. The problem then was we were trying to make the bigger picture, and just allow myself a couple of minutes of personal indulgence. I've been doing service management longer than I've been doing IT. So I came in to IT because I was a warehousing expert delivering services, and then they computerized it. And I've always tried to get the message through that we should worry about service management, the bigger picture. IT is just one part of it. And the problem with service support delivery focus was we were focused on the technology too much. There were efforts to try and get other qualifications going, but they never really took off in quite that way. But I got involved in version 2 a little bit as a contributor. I joined Axios company in the private sector and then went freelance. So I was involved then as an outsider contributing rather than a driver of it, although I was still very involved through ITSMF. And if we're trying to keep this chronological, you need to realize also that the big driving factor that made service management and ITIL work around the world was when the ITIMF, originally, the IT Infrastructure Management Forum, started working and holding its annual conferences and other seminars. So I talked about the private sector driving it and CCTA themselves, but the biggest factor that really made it happen was the volunteers got a focus, and the ITSMF, as it's now called, started being the place to come to talk about and the conference to go to, and started producing supporting pocketbooks and those kind of issues.
So when did ITIMF get translated to the word called IT Service Management Forum? Was it a logical movement that it moved from ITIMF to ITSMF? And when was it the ITSMF International formally launched in place?
I'm wondering whether to tell you some of the complicated truth or the nice simple story. But ITIMF started in the UK, Norwich, in David Wheeldon's spare bedroom. And you thank David Wheeldon for the ITIMF really happening, and for an awful lot of other things. He wrote the first ever book, and is still out there occasionally doing a bit of work. So the ITIMF was a volunteer effort, and then it got bigger and started employing some staff and got an office. It was because the Netherlands were so closely involved. We had Dutch people on the board, and then they set their own organisation up. So the ITIMF Netherlands. And then there was set up a sort of collaboration body called ITIMF International. And it consisted at its biggest of UK and the Netherlands, and then South Africa and Australia started happening. Then the word service management was being talked about. That term didn't come in until the 90s. It wasn't there in the first few years of ITIL. Nobody talked about service management. But the term, I don't know where it came from, but it started being the term of preference. So when the user group created in South Africa, and David Cannon in his pre-America days was the man who made that happen in South Africa, it was called IT Service Management Forum. So that was the first ITSMF, was actually ITSMF South Africa. And then the other existing ITIMFs came into line. And ironically, I think either the UK or the Netherlands was the last one to change its name. But that was because management was formed. So it was back converted, if you like. And then in the early 2000s, a new version of ITSMF International became sort of more formalized. But the chapters used to meet with a representative every 2 to 3 months, and then there were so many chapters that we couldn't make that work. It was too many people. So a governing body was elected in Montreal in 2003, I think it was, and then ITSMF, as it sort of is today, created there. But it was the second incarnation. The first one actually went bankrupt.
Right. So in terms of coming back again to the context of ITSM a little later, but ISO IC 20000, if you look at from where it has actually evolved, and it is still as part of ITSMF, is that a right understanding? Because from all the ISO standards that I've seen, ISO IC 20000 is still a part of ITSMF umbrella, because I've seen, I did the practitioner certificate and other stuff. It still has the logo with ITSMF. So is it still on the cards? What's the plan for ISO IC 20000 from a...
I'm not sure of the plan in the future. I can tell you the past. You need to remember and be careful to separate ISO 20000, the standard, from the certification scheme. And ITSMF did get involved in the certification scheme, and they were contributors to the standard. It's quite an interesting story of how the project happened. Right at the beginning, the first version of BSI produced was a PD called a published document about service management. It talked about service management, and it had a lot of the stuff that ITIL has in it, but without ever referencing that ITIL existed.
Right.
BSI rules required them to revisit that after a set period of years. So they came to me as the ITIL manager for Exim and said, I was told to talk to you about it. And I said, well, there's a bit of bitterness. And we had a meeting with David Wheeldon and others. And what happened was they said, I have to revisit this document. We said, well, we're rewriting ITIL. We have on the plans a management introduction to ITIL. How about we put on the table an offer? We will not write that management introduction. We will help you write a new version of the BSI book, and it will serve as the management introduction to ITIL. And that was the deal we struck. So that's how ITIL and ITSMF and BSI formally signed a concordat, and that's how the standards, if you like, unusually, as you say, very much for British standards and then later for ISO. This was BS 15,000 first.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
unusual. They got involved with supporting documentation, but that was the deal. We struck that in the Ultracomp office in St Neots in East England a long time ago. So that's why it's unusual, and that's why the products are informally at least linked together and taken forward. So the team that wrote that PD 0005 then went on to write BS 15,000, the first standard. And because ITSM, if you like, had that contact, they said that they wanted to create a certification scheme alongside it. And that's why the ITSMF logo was on the certification scheme.
Right. I got it. So that brings a question. I'm asking this question. I think I will ask the same question to you. If you look at ISO IEC 20000 2011 standard, I mean, one of the tall claim that we bring it is moving away from IT and say it's service management and opening it up for non-IT services that can use and get themselves endorsed. But if you look at the standard, and I have my personal standard of personal copy of the standard, ISO IEC 20000 2011 still says as IT service management standard. It does not remove that IT for that. So if I was supposed to do a proofreading, which I know this is my integral part of removing that piece, why was this overlooked? I mean, what's your thought?
Yeah, it wasn't overlooked. It was regrettably shelved, and there are different opinions on this. If you look at the ITSMF logo, you will see that traditionally it's a lowercase IT and then a big SMF.
Correct.
The idea was that was the first step to removing the IT altogether. ITIMF was all capitals, and ITSMF was IT said quietly, SMF said loudly. And the expectation would then move to the SMF. When we rewrote ITIL in version 3, which I'm sure we'll come on to in a bit, as the ITSMF International Publications Director, I ran and facilitated the workshops for scoping that. And one of the big questions we put in was, should we move away from IT? Should we make it IL rather than ITIL? That never really flew. But my personal background, as I say, is that I've come from service management. IT was never the important bit to me. I was in a group called Services Group. We did warehousing and catering, and then we computerized the store. So I have a very, very clear picture that service management is what it is, and IT can sometimes be useful and sometimes not. We asked this question within the standard as well, and my recollection is that there were issues because we were in part of BSI, called DISC in those days, it no longer exists, that was focused on information systems. So there wasn't the remit to produce a standard on general service management. There are other issues with ITIL as well, of stepping on toes. ITIL was written by CCTA, Central Computer and Telecommunications Agency. Perhaps it should have been written by the Department of Trade and Industry about service management in general, but it was written by an IT organization. So the IT has been there, and it came in, and there's a bit of tail wagging the dog in that respect. The reason IT didn't drop off ITSMF was because we realized 95 at least, maybe 99% of our members were in IT. And that we felt we would actually disenfranchise that. So the IT has stayed because that's where the interest and, to be honest, the money is. And that's the real reason why we still got IT involved.
I totally agree with you, but when I go to a customer and he's a non-IT company, a manufacturing or a pharmaceutical company, when I open it up, they say, okay, this is a standard for compliance. It looks at the first page across and says, you know what? You're cheating me, and this seems to be an IT service management standard. So that's where the whole discussion comes, because it's very difficult to articulate and sell the value of service management, because people have their own notions when they just read an article and say, this is what it says. What you say in this one does not match each other, right? And that's a disconnect to that. Now, coming just shifting gears, you've been in this journey from, as you rightly said, you've been first in service management rather than IT. And we have actually gone through about 20 plus years in this whole journey. How has been the adoption for companies when it was version 1, version 2, and version 3? I want a candid opinion across the globe. I mean, we should not talk about the US and the UK and the Australian, where they have a far more understanding of what's been there, and they've been getting involved in it right from the beginning. But looking at across geographies, how has been the adoption of service management using ITIL as a framework? I mean, how has it been in reality for an end user organization?
The way it's been taken up is been interesting. As you say, in the UK, it was driven initially by IT people. There isn't. There are other systems, of course, worth mentioning that drive service management. I mean, my background before a proper job was in organisation and methods, and I think that it's evolved into probably business analysis these days, and there is some interesting work coming on now to link ITIL with business analysis. So watch this space. On that respect, you'll probably be getting invited to contribute. But we will. The take up is interesting because there's two ways it's been taken up. IT people have been driving it up from the bottom, which is always the practical way these things happen. Everything you read suggests that you should drive this from the top down, but the reality is always that people at the bottom get excited, and that's been what happened around the world. If you look at I work for IBM, but I will confess that one of the big step changes was when Hewlett Packard put enormous weight behind ITIL and drove it through. That got into HP in the States through HP in the Netherlands, and that was by consultants who were interested to push the idea in, and IT people pushed the idea in. I think that maybe is happening slightly less now as ITIL is being seen as a bigger issue, and I find it really interesting to talk to people. I haven't done as much work as I would love in Asia, and I've 3 days in India in my entire life, and I would love to remedy that before I finally give up. So if anybody wants some help in India, let me know. But I have done a bit of work in the Middle East recently, and it's interesting there where you're talking to people from all over the world, but they're coming to ITIL version 3 now, so we haven't got that history, and there isn't so much legacy of ITIL version 1 and 2. Not that they were IT focused, but that they were much more technical focused. You can now lead into ITIL from strategy because there is a book called Service Strategy, and if you come into ITIL from that strategy perspective, IT is not the central point. You're asking questions about what services are you doing. So I'm seeing now that companies that are coming to ITIL new are much better placed to look at service management than the ones who've been involved in a while, because they've got the internal IT legacy that you were talking about. So I think the companies that are most fun to work with now are the ones that are coming to it from scratch, because you have much more chance to talk to people who are not IT techies.
Correct. So with the ITIL version 3 and particularly 2011, one of the things with Axelos coming into picture, I wanted to get as well the thoughts is to come up with some supplementary publications. So one of the people say that it only says, what is what. It doesn't say how to do it, because it's just a best practice framework, and it is involved with the consultants and people to interpret how it works into their environment. But do you think having implementation guidelines of how to do service management will help? Would that be a good practice to add supplementary publications along with the 5 core volumes for end user organization to get benefit? I'm not talking about consulting organizations like IBM and HP and Accenture, but going beyond the consumers, the end user organizations, to get benefited through these stuff.
Well, yeah, and I think that was always the intention since version 1 in a way. And it's interesting to see ISO 20000 looking to produce implementation guidance. And ironically, I think they've done a better job of it than ITIL. Although conceptually they should have a harder job to do that because of the history and tradition of it. But in fact, I think they've done a good job. And people like Erin Castile have done, and Jenny Dugmore, of course, the mother of ISO 20000, has always had this focus on producing guidance, both official and related, to help people do things. And of course it's crucial. The danger, though, is I mentioned SSADM back in the past, and I remember do my SSADM course, and them saying to me, the great thing about this kind of method and how to do things guidance is it makes average, in this case average programmers do good work. You have to bear in mind that it also makes great programmers do good work. And that's the danger of any set of implementation guidance that's seen as too rigorous. It makes average people perform above them, but it can sometimes take away the genius. And programming, you can be fairly methodical and say this is a structured approach. Companies and service management is still so different from place to place and demand to demand, and corporate attitude makes a big difference to the way you do service management. So I would like to see more of that said about, getting the point. Here is some good guidance that usually works, but do bear in mind that service management, more than other places, you need to understand the next line up, what the business is trying to do, and adapt the way you do it. I've always tried to say and to write that, but I think you're absolutely right. The companies that do it need some guidance, and it needs to be different kinds of guidance than we've had, because that accidentally, in a way, has driven towards consultants. This is how you do it. Go in and ask these questions. So here is a maturity level. Go in and ask these questions and tell them that they need to move from 3 to 4, and guess how much you can charge to help them do it.
Correct.
We haven't got the guidance. If you like, we've got too much guidance on how to cook and not enough on how to enjoy the meal.
Exactly. That's pretty much.
That's exactly. I think you're right on there. We need to get some guidance out, or some advice to people, and ITSMF is so well placed to do that, to get people to come together and say, how do I get the benefits of these people coming in and telling me what to do? And I think there's a real opportunity there. And obviously, that's the kind of area I'm very interested in, having come from the business background. And I've got so many things half started, but I've got certainly some guidance there on it's guidance for customers. There's 2 levels to it. We need to help people receive it. We also need to help those people in organizations that deliver service management in understanding what they need from their customers, because that's a relationship that's untapped.
True.
I had some great ideas from Pauline Angelico back when she was in the business on that, and we were always going to write the book, but Pauline's moved on to better areas. So if anybody wants to help me do it, I'd love to hear from them.
Right. So coming on to the ITSMF, as you rightly mentioned a point, when people are quite curious and anxious to actually deliver service management, the capabilities of service management for end user benefits, how does ITSMF play a role? I mean, let's spark about the reality of what happens in ITSMF. How does ITSMF help in engaging the community meaningfully, right? For someone who's just learned the books but does not have experience, how does ITSMF help in the whole journey of service management? What's your thoughts? I mean, across looking at UK, international, and all of the leading chapters in ITSMF.
Right. It is. I mean, remember, ITSMF has been around for 23 years now, and it's changed as it's gone. It was very carefully named in the first place, and the important letter was the F at the end. I do remember writing an article back with Pippa in the early days, making sure that we keep the F in ITSMF. You're careful how you say that. But that word forum was there deliberately. That's what the people originally tried to create, a forum for people to come together and discuss things. And it's really important to remember that F word, because it's what ITSMF should be about, an opportunity for people to come together and say, oh my God, I'm not the only one suffering like this. It's a self-help group. That was the intention. It grew very successful and became, and still is in some places, a little bit too commercial, because it got successful. There was a lot of money made in the years before the 2008 recession really hit. ITSMF could do no wrong. It got bigger, it got richer. It was employing probably over 200 people around the world, actually, as employees, and it became a sort of self-supplying group. Almost every ITSMF had real trouble after the crash, and you can understand that the focus was on survival, and the people employed in it worried about their jobs. So the focus got diverted a little bit, I suspect. And I'm as guilty as anyone. I was involved in ITSMF UK and international at that point. I think we need to remember, and I think you've got the opportunity, and I can see you're doing a great job in India of actually almost inventing ITSMF in the way that it was built in the UK and the Netherlands in the first place, as a group of a lot of people coming fresh to an idea and wanting to talk about it. So I can see, in India, I would be very surprised if in 5 years' time India is not actually leading the rest of the world in this, because you have the potential and the interest, and you have that fresh new view on things. In other parts of the world, I don't want to call it a compromise, but in the US, for example, for the conference to work, it's now combined with SDI or HDI approach. That means it drives it into broader areas, and it isn't as focused on what we've talked about, the service management concept. So it drags it back a little bit into the IT side. So I'm really interested to see what you're doing in India, and I think that's got massive potential for getting the rest of the world back on track.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in fact, when I joined, because I was serving on the ITSM of Singapore board for a couple of years, and then I joined as board of director in the last year, June. It's very difficult because 6 years we did not do anything for various reasons. I do not want to blame. So people really lost the touch of ITSMF. So I actually went across every pillar to post, meeting people with what I had my connects, and say, give us a chance. We want to do something, but if you don't join hands, we will be left alone. So I think over a period of time, we have actually been able to start 5 chapters. I'm actually starting another chapter in Hyderabad on 5th of September. Now people are starting to see, one of the things we always have a trouble is when vendors get in and promote their own opportunities of their business. So becoming a vendor neutral organization is a tough job, because we need to also have a flat wallet to actually run these events. So we definitely need support from vendors to do that. So we need to make a striking balance between the stuff to get it moving across. But hopefully we will get some insights as some of these things happen across.
I mean, it's important to an extent. There came a time where it was almost an insult in ITSMF to be called a vendor. But without the vendors, none of this would have happened.
Exactly.
The money in the first place came. The first ITIL books were launched at events sponsored by vendors. The vendors put the money, and these days they tend to be one of the very few places that can supply people to be actively involved, or even that's not as true as it used to be. So when we were restructuring ITSMF in the UK, when David Wilden resigned and stopped being involved, we had to sort of relook at what we were. And I'm very proud of a phrase that I created then that I still hold to, is that we need to remember that ITSMF is 2 things. It's a user group and a trade association. And we shouldn't be ashamed of being a trade association, because we actually need a trade association. There's all sorts of things the vendors do that are wasting efforts. I mean, if you look at ITTs, the number of invitations to tender and requests, RFPs that go out there, that are wheels being reinvented thousands of times around the world. That vendors having to answer the same question from different people all the time. There is actually benefit for both trade and customers of realizing that there's nothing wrong with a trade association and getting these people together. It's done wonders in the motor industry for safety and other things. So that we shouldn't be ashamed of the vendors. We should get them involved, but we have to understand that you need both involved to make these things happen.
I think it's a very, very valid point, and I talk to a lot of these people and say, don't have the wrong notion of just talking about it's a vendor. They're talking about conference booths and other stuff. They have a lot of skin in the game. To be frank enough, for the last ITSM of India conference that along with the board that we did not get a single sponsor, right? Because we didn't prove anything in the market, right? So it took us a year now. But now we have got a lot of support, including Axelos, we have Manage Engine, TCS, and other companies have gone because they have now seen results happening. And without them, we cannot host a good conference and give value for our members. So it's a chicken and egg story. But if you don't get our right trade associations, we cannot make this a sustainable one. So I think that's a very fair point, that you need to take it in the merit and look at it and evaluate to make sure that that strikes a proper balance in terms of delivering value to the community and also getting mutual benefits, right? So it's an ecosystem by itself. So
yeah, I mean the other thing is also getting the right message out to the vendors about what their benefit is. And I mean I work for a big vendor these days, and I've had similar conversations with other big vendors that there's a misunderstanding. They have some of them have a short-term view. They think if I sponsor an event and come along, I will sell lots of tools, training, consultancy, and they judge success of involvement at that event simply by how many direct leads they got from it, and that's not really what it's about. It's about showing that you're a player in this industry. It's more like advertising than direct sales. And you go along to a conference, you walk around, you talk to people, maybe 6, 9, 12 months later, you're thinking of getting some consultancy or buying a tool. In your mind are the people you spoke to that were interesting. And that's the value to the vendors. It's not a direct one. And that message needs to get out to the vendors sometimes.
Correct. I agree, because when I asked a vendor across, are you not showcasing today's in this conference? No, last year we didn't get a lot of leads across, so we decided to stop this particular thing because they're looking at direct leads. So it's looking at more of a relationship. It's looking at thinking in their mind, if my customer has got a problem, okay, there is someone who could help us to do that. So it's some kind of a different perspective to do that. I think we will have a lot of things that we can discuss across, but we'll have a limited amount of time that we will have for this edition of podcast. So I think one final question would be, what would be your comment for ITSM professionals in India and their association with ITSM India? Because I'm actually struggling and also harboring to get more memberships and more building the community at large. So what would be your piece of advice or thoughts in terms of building this ITSM community through ITSM of India? That would be my personal take as well, as to how we can do this better and take this the ecosystem a little more brighter.
Well, I mean, first of all, don't underestimate how well you're doing, because I think at the moment, in the economic climates and the difficulty and the maturity of this, it's a slow task. I think, but the big message is realizing, Ken Wendell used to say, people have to understand what's in it for them. And it's the communication possibilities, and people have lots of benefits to get from being involved in ITSMF, and therefore in the community, not just to receive but also to contribute. And an awful people would like to think that to contribute, to come along, to be involved in discussions, to comment on publications, to suggest what needs to be had. So there's an opportunity for anyone who sees themselves as spending the next 20 years in this industry. Then ITSMF is crucial to them, because it gives them the contacts and the relationships that will pay back over 20 years. This isn't a short-term thing. I mean, the fact that I'm surviving now, a lot of the fact that I'm still alive and feeding the dog, is because of the work and the contacts. And it didn't feel like work 20 years ago, but I still know a lot of people and we can communicate. So it's understanding that they're in a community, whether they want to be or not, and that ITSMF is the way they can articulate and get involved in that. But you do have to deliver benefits. That's something we found in the early days of ITIMF and ITSMF. We 12, 15 really excited, interested people would come together and have tremendous ideas, and meet again 2 months later and have tremendous ideas, and nothing happened in between. Right. And that changed in the UK when we employed somebody full-time, Aidan Law. He came in, not because Aidan was great and did wonderful work, but it wasn't the fact that only Aidan could do it, it's the fact that it was Aidan's day job to make that happen. So instead of excited volunteers coming up with ideas, it was the delivery, and the focus on delivery makes an enormous difference. So you need to make sure that the people coming in a week, a month, 3 months later will see something back to their enrollment. It can be their name on a white paper, it can be a seminar or a webinar or whatever, but it's important that you deliver between great ideas. And I was as guilty as any, and probably more guilty than most, in just getting really excited about the ideas but forgetting to actually do something.
Yeah.
And that would be my strongest advice. And I've given that to volunteer organisations in other areas as well. And the message we learned here, it's a message I learned initially at university. But student television we were making then, and now it's IT, and it's the same thing that I've seen for 50 years really. You've got to do more than have great ideas, you've actually got to deliver. And it's not so much fun, damn it, but it's important.
Excellent. I think that's a very key point. We need to be doers rather than talkers, because as people to do that, that's a very powerful message to do that. So we have an upcoming webinar that I'm actually doing as part of ITSM India is careers in service management industry. One thing is, a lot of people who are aspiring to be in service management space, but they don't know, is it going to be tools, it could be process, it could be partner. So I'm just trying to do a Q&A just to promote as form of knowledge sharing and insights of how people can do. I'm just tying it up with Invensys company, and then it's going to be done on 30th of August at 10 to 11 GMT. So we hope to create more awareness of what is this, because we have spent some amount of years, about 15 years in this industry. So we have some know-hows about it, so we can share our experience and get their insights of what they are looking at in the service management state beyond the certification spree, but how we can do. And that's why this information on the ITSMF role and what they can look at as a community will help them to gain some insights as part of takeaways to do that. So that's what I think would be quite beneficial.
I think that's important, and you touched on beyond the certification. And I think that's a really important phrase. There's so many people around the world who've done an ITIL foundation course and think, they put a tick in a box, done ITIL, and I'm driving up to Scotland this afternoon to teach one this week, and the first message I give to them, this is a foundation course. It'll tell you some basics. If you're good, you'll come out of this with more questions than answers. So there's so far to go. We've got a little bit sidetracked by certification because there's so much money in it. I know when I was working with Capita, helping them win the bid in the first place, I did a couple of days up there. It was very hard because they were focused so much on the certification because that's so much of the money. You've got to realize that that's just a part of the potential here. For the real people out there who ITSMF are looking for, there's a much bigger landscape.
Yeah, and there's also much of the people who do the certifications don't get an opportunity to experience that in their day-to-day jobs. So they have to get particular insight either by knowing or talking with people or understanding what the landscape look like, because everybody has their certification and they say, okay, this will help me to jump from an existing role to another role. They don't understand the nature of competencies and skills that are essential to build that as part of stuff. So that's something that I'm going to talk about on 30th. I will also send an invite to share it across with all of people who can just come and debate and ask these questions. What's been happening across, and we'll also gain some perspectives from that. So that's great to do. But if you have last-minute thoughts before we do it, I know that we have a lot of things to talk, and I will definitely meet you when I'm in ITSM UK this year. And to be great to be meeting in person, Ivor.
Yeah, I would look forward to it. I haven't worked out how I'm going to get down there yet because we're having some issues with membership. But I will certainly try and get down and catch up with you. And if you're around in the country, then that will be great. And as I say, I do live in hope. I've been in this business for an awfully long time, but I hope I'm not quite dead yet. I've still got a few more years to go. So as well as looking back, I'm keen to be be forward. And I had 3 days at a conference in Mumbai, and I'd certainly like to get the chance to get back to India sometime. So
we will be great and honored when we get you again in India. That's something that we will definitely want to see, because I think when people look at people who have been in this journey, it's kind of more inspiring to get passionate people across saying that we need to get selected. So, and one thing to be assured, Ivor, you have a lot more to offer for people who are aspirants in this industry. So your job is still not yet done with IBM.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot, viewers. Ivor. Yeah, thanks, Ivor, for your splendid time. It's been a delight to talk about the history of ITIL, the ITSMF, and how you've been encouraging us in terms of our contribution to the ITSM India and ITSM industry perspective. So we are so glad. So as I encourage all of the viewers to join us for Careers in ITSM Industry on 30th of August along with Invensys Learning. And we look forward to having another guest and meet you again next year, next edition. Until then, people who are in Hyderabad, stay tuned. We are launching our 5th chapter in 5th of September in your location. So it's a good opportunity for us to join. And as I said, as Ivor said, to make meaningful representation of ITSMF and build a community. Thanks, everybody, and take care. Good afternoon, probably, Ivor, and have a rest of the day. Enjoyable.
Thank you very much.